Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing good. So in today's session, I will be discussing about the structure of Indian banks. And I will be discussing about the public sector banks, private sector banks, foreign sector banks, other categories of banks and their role and their performance. तो चलिए शुरू करते हैं without wasting any time. So firstly, we will understand the structure of the Indian banking system as it is very crucial for analyzing the dynamics, challenges and the operational strategies of different categories of the banks. जो इंडियन बैंकिंग सिस्टम है उसको डिवाइड किया गया है इनटू द थ्री ब्रॉड कैटेगरीज विच आर बेस्ड ऑन द ओनरशिप दैट इज द पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक, प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक एंड द फॉरेन बैंक्स. And each category has its distinct features, operational models, and the regulatory framework. So the very first is the public sector banks. पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स वो बैंक्स हैं जिनमें गवर्नमेंट जो है वो होल्ड करती है मेजॉरिटी स्टेक्स विच इज़ मोर देन 50%. और ये बैंक्स काफ़ी क्रिटिकल और इम्पॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करते हैं इन द इंडियन बैंकिंग सिस्टम, इन द फाइनेंशियल इंक्लूजन एंड इन द इकोनॉमी एट लार्ज. जो पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स होते हैं ये ऑन और कंट्रोल किए जाते हैं बाय द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एंड देयर रोल एक्सटेंड्स बियॉन्ड जस्ट बैंकिंग सर्विसेज to include the economic development and the social welfare. So the key characteristics of the public sector banks are the ownership and the control. As we all know that public sector banks are owned and controlled by the government of India, and majority, that means 51 or more percent of the equity is held by the government of India or the state governments. Regulations. Then public sector banks are regulated by the Reserve Bank of India and the Ministry of Finance and the Government of India. Public sector banks are typically more capitalized than other banks due to the government backing, and they often raise capital through public issues, and the government occasionally infuses additional funds when required. So public sector banks जो होते हैं वो focus करते हैं on the financial inclusion, credit to the priority sectors like the agriculture, MSMEs, and the weaker section of the society. And they provide the long-term financing for the infrastructure, industrial development, and the social welfare projects. And the public sector banks serve to the both rural as well as to the urban markets with a large network of branches, especially in underserved areas. So the examples of public sector banks are State Bank of India, Punjab National Bank, Bank of Baroda, Canara Bank, Bank of India, and many more. So the challenges what they faced is the operational inefficiencies. So government control often leads to the bureaucratic inefficiencies, and public sector banks have higher levels of non-performing assets as they are required to lend to priority sectors with lower credit ratings. And public sector banks are slow in the technological upgradation if I compare with the private banks or the foreign banks, as they lag in adopting the new technology and the digitization. So next one is the private sector banks. Private sector banks जो हैं वो own और control किए जाते हैं by the private individuals, institutions or the companies, and they operate on a for-profit model. The government may hold some stake, but the majority of the shares are in the private hands. So the key characteristics of the private sector banks are the ownership and control, as they owned by the private entities, but ये regulate किए जाते हैं by the Reserve Bank of India, और जो governments का stake होता है is generally limited or to less than 50% as compared to the public sector banks. And next one is the regulation. It is similar to the public sector banks, बट जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स होते हैं वो रेगुलेट किए जाते हैं बाय द रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया, और जो बैंकिंग रेगुलेशन एक्ट है 1949 वो गवर्न करता है इसकी फंक्शनिंग को. नेक्स्ट वन इज द कैपिटल स्ट्रक्चर. These banks often have more flexibility in raising the capital as they tend to attract the foreign investments as well, and they make issue shares and bonds to raise the funds. तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स फोकस करते हैं लाइक द एम्फोसिस ऑन कस्टमर सर्विसेज, टेक्नोलॉजिकल इनोवेशन एंड द प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी, एंड दे फास्टर द डिसीजन मेकिंग ड्यू टू द एब्सेंस ऑफ पॉलिटिकल इंटरफेरेंस, एंड दे फोकस ऑन द अर्बन एंड सेमी अर्बन मार्केट्स, though real penetration is gradually increasing. So the examples of private sector banks are HDFC Bank, ICICI Bank, Axis Bank, Kotak Mahindra Bank, Yes Bank, and many more. So the challenges faced by the private sector banks are the high competition. जैसे कि इनका जो मेन फोकस है वो है प्रॉफिटेबिलिटी पे, तो प्राइवेट बैंक्स जो हैं वो काफ़ी इंटेंस कंपटीशन को फेस करते हैं फ्रॉम बोथ पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स एज वेल एज फ्रॉम द फॉरेन बैंक्स. Next one is the customer acquisition and the retention. While they often excel in the customer services, attracting and retaining customers in the rural and the underserved areas can be challenging for the private sector banks. Regulatory constraint, even though they are privately owned, but they still operate under the stringent regulations by the Reserve Bank of India, and they subject to social welfare mandates such as priority sector lending and many more. Next one is the foreign banks. Foreign banks in India are the branches or the subsidiaries of the banks that are incorporated outside of India. तो जो फॉरेन बैंक्स होते हैं वो प्राइमरली सर्व करते हैं टू द लार्ज कॉर्पोरेट क्लाइंट्स, high net worth individuals, or the foreign business operating in the India. They often offer a range of services like the commercial banking, investment banking, wealth management, and the treasury services. So the key characteristics of the foreign banks are ownership and control. Foreign banks जो हैं वो properly or fully owned किए जाते हैं by the foreign entities, but they are also subject to the Indian banking regulations which are set by the Reserve Bank of India. सेकेंड वन इज द रेगुलेशन. फॉरेन बैंक्स जो हैं इंडिया में वो रेगुलेट किए जाते हैं बाय द रिजर्व बैंक ऑफ इंडिया एंड दे आर ऑल्सो रिक्वायर्ड टू कंप्लाई विद द फॉरेन एक्सचेंज मैनेजमेंट एक्ट, दैट इज फेमा. थर्ड वन इज द कैपिटल स्ट्रक्चर. जो फॉरेन बैंक्स हैं इंडिया में वो जनरली वेल कैपिटलाइज्ड हैं एंड दे हैव द एडवांटेज ऑफ ग्लोबल फंडिंग सोर्सेज. फॉरेन बैंक्स फोकस करते हैं टू द हाई एंड कॉर्पोरेट बैंकिंग एंड द इन्वेस्टमेंट बैंकिंग सर्विसेज. They focus to the wealth management and advisory services to the high net worth individuals. They niche and specialized products catering to the international trade and the investment. So the examples of foreign banks are HSBC India, Citibank India, Standard Chartered Bank, and many more. So the challenges which are faced by the foreign banks are, the very first is regulatory compliance. जो फॉरेन बैंक्स होते हैं उनको नेविगेट करना पड़ता है कॉम्प्लेक्स रेगुलेटरी फ्रेमवर्क जो कि उनके होम कंट्रीज से उनको डिफर करता है. सेकेंड वन इज द लिमिटेड रीच. फॉरेन बैंक्स जो हैं ये मोर फोकस होते हैं टूवर्ड्स द अर्बन सेंटर्स एंड द कॉर्पोरेट क्लाइंट्स एंड दे हैव लिमिटेड पेनिट्रेशन इन द रूरल एज वेल एज इन द सेमी अर्बन एरियाज. कॉस्ट ऑफ कॉम्प्लायंस. Complying with the Reserve Bank of India regulation, they include priority sector lending requirements can increase their operational costs. So basically these are the other categories of the banks in India. So in addition to the public, private and foreign banks, the Indian bank system is also includes the other types of banks that also play the important and the vital role. So the very first is the cooperative bank. Cooperative bank smaller bank होते हैं और ये ऑफन रीजनली फोकस करते हैं जो कि ऑर्गेनाइज्ड और ऑपरेट करते हैं एज अ कोऑपरेटिव्स. तो ये प्रोवाइड करते हैं फाइनेंशियल सर्विसेज मेनली टू द रूरल एंड द सेमी अर्बन पॉपुलेशंस एंड दे आर फर्दर क्लासिफाइड इनटू द अर्बन कोऑपरेटिव बैंक्स एज वेल एज इन द रूरल कोऑपरेटिव बैंक्स. सेकेंड वन इज द रीजनल रूरल बैंक्स. जो ये बैंक्स होते हैं ये स्टैब्लिश किए गए हैं टू प्रोवाइड द क्रेडिट एंड बैंकिंग सर्विसेज टू द रूरल पॉपुलेशन, especially to the small farmers, rural artisans and workers. तो ये jointly own किए गए हैं by the central government, state government and the sponsors bank. Third one is the small finance banks. ये small size bank होते हैं जो create किए गए हैं to promote the financial inclusion, primarily targeting underserved sectors such as the small farmers, micro industries and the unorganized workers. Fourth one is the payment banks. ये banks जो है वो नॉन लैंडिंग एंटिटीज़ हैं जो ऑफर करती हैं बेसिक फाइनेंशियल सर्विसेज लाइक द सेविंग अकाउंट्स, मनी ट्रांसफर्स एंड मोबाइल बैंकिंग एंड दे आर प्राइमरली डिजाइन फॉर प्रमोटिंग द फाइनेंशियल इंक्लूजन. सो नाउ वी आर गोइंग टू रीड अबाउट द रोल एंड द परफॉर्मेंस ऑफ वेरियस कैटेगरीज ऑफ द इंडियन बैंक्स. सो इन द इंडियन बैंकिंग सेक्टर ईच टाइप ऑफ बैंक which is like public sector bank, private sector banks, foreign banks, they play a distinct role in the economy and they has their own performance characteristics based on their business models target customers, and regulatory environments. So these are the roles of public sector banking. The very first is the financial inclusion. Public sector banks काफ़ी important role play करते हैं in driving the financial inclusion in the India, and they are present in the rural and underserved areas और offer करते हैं banking services जैसे कि saving accounts, loans and remittances. Public sector banks इनका काफ़ी broader reach है as compared to the private or foreign banks, which makes them crucial in the government's financial inclusion strategy. Next one is the serving priority sectors. जो पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंकिंग है ये रिक्वायर्ड करते हैं टू एलोकेट अ पोर्शन ऑफ देयर लोन्स टू द प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर्स लाइक द एग्रीकल्चर, एमएसएमईज, एजुकेशन, हाउसिंग एंड अदर सेक्टर्स which are important for the economic development. So this aligns with the government's broader goal of fostering the inclusive economic growth. Next one is the economic development. जो पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स होते हैं ये काफ़ी इंपॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करते हैं इन फंडिंग द लार्ज इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स, हाउसिंग स्कीम्स एंड द गवर्नमेंट इनिशिएटिव्स जैसे कि सब्सिडीज एंड द डायरेक्ट बेनिफिट ट्रांसफर्स. नेक्स्ट वन इज द गवर्नमेंट स्कीम्स एंड द वेलफेयर. Public sector banks act as the primary channel for implementing the government's welfare schemes, including direct transfer of the subsidies, pensions, and the financial literacy programs. These are the performance of public sector banks. So the very first is the non-performing assets. It is one of the primary challenge which is faced by the public sector banks, that is the high level of non-performing assets. ये क्यों है? विद द कम्बिनेशन ऑफ फैक्टर्स जैसे कि पुअर क्रेडिट मैनेजमेंट होगी, पॉलिटिकल इंटरफेरेंस होगी इन द लैंडिंग डिसीजंस और द इकोनॉमिक स्लो डाउन. तो जो पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स हैं उनको हायर डिफॉल्ट रेट्स फेस करना पड़ता है एज कम्पेयर टू द प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स. सो इफ आई टॉक अबाउट द रिसेंट स्टार्ट, then as of the recent years, public sector banks contribute a significant proportion of total NPAs in the banking sector, though the government has been taking steps to resolve this issue through the recapitalization and the stricter lending norms. So the second one is the capital adequacy. Public sector banks are often capitalized by the government, especially जब उनको need होती है for the recapitalizations to meet the Basel III norms or to absorb the losses due to the NPAs. Despite this, their capital adequacy ratios often lag behind the private banks, limiting their capacity to lend. Third one is the technological advancement. जो public sector banks हैं वो काफ़ी slow हैं in adopting the digital banking as compared to the private counterparts. However, अगर मैं recent years की बात करूँ तो government काफ़ी push कर रही है for digitization through the प्रधानमंत्री जन धन योजना or the initiatives which have been taken like the Digital India, which improves their online and mobile banking services. Next one is the profitability. Historically, public sector banks have faced challenges in their profitability due to the higher provisioning of NPAs and they lower their margins compared to the private and the foreign banks. However, जो इनके efforts हैं वो improve कर रहे हैं इनकी management को और reduce कर रहे हैं bad loans को, which is led to some improvements in the recent years. So the examples of public sector banks are like the SBI. It is the India's largest public sector bank and it has been actively involved in financial inclusion and also offers a wide range of digital services. So next one is the private sector banks. Now we are going to read about the role of the private sector banks. So very first is the profit maximization and the efficiency. जो private sector banks होते हैं they are profit driven and they focus on maximizing the shareholders' value through the efficient operation, innovative services and the technological advancement. Second one is the technological leadership. ये जो banks होते हैं ये lead करते हैं to the charge in digital banking and the customer-centric innovation और ये offer करते हैं cutting edge mobile apps, internet banking platforms, fintech solutions और banking को more accessible बनाते हैं और convenient करते हैं for tech savvy consumers. Third one is the urban and corporate focus. Private banks predominantly cater to urban areas and corporate clients. They provide a full range of services जैसे कि including retail banking, corporate banking, investment banking and the wealth management. Fourth one is the risk management. सो एज कम्पेयर टू द पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स, जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स होते हैं ये जनरली मोर रोबस्ट रिस्क मैनेजमेंट प्रैक्टिसेस को फॉलो करते हैं और फोकस करते हैं ऑन मैक्सिमाइजिंग द रिटर्न्स वाइल मैनेजिंग द रिस्क एफिशिएंटली एंड दे हैव अ लोअर लेवल ऑफ एनपीएस. So these are the performance of private sector banks. So the very first is the growth and the profitability. Private sector banks consistently outperform public sector banks in profitability, efficiency and market capitalization. They have lower the operating cost, better risk management and the higher return on equity. So if I talk about the recent stats, then the private banks like HDFC, ICICI and Axis Bank, they consistently reporting the higher growth in the profits. They have the strong balance sheets and robust capital adequacy ratios which allows them to expand their loan books and offer competitive interest rates. So the second one is the NPAs and the asset quality. So private banks generally have lower NPAs as compared to the public sector banks due to the better credit risk assessment and the proactive management of the bad loans. अगर मैं recent years की बात करूं तो कुछ ऐसे private banks हैं जिन्होंने face किया है increase in the NPAs particularly in the corporate loan sector. Third one is the capital adequacy. जो private sector banks हैं they tend to maintain higher capital adequacy ratios compared to the public sector banks which allows them to absorb shocks better and pursue aggressive growth strategies. Next one is the technological adoption. जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स जैसे कि HDFC, ICICI ये काफ़ी मतलब कि दे आर पायनियरिंग इन द डिजिटल बैंकिंग इन इंडिया एंड दे प्रोवाइडिंग द ईजी एक्सेस टू द बैंकिंग सर्विसेज थ्रू मोबाइल एप्स, ऑनलाइन बैंकिंग प्लेटफॉर्म्स एंड कैशलेस transactions. So the examples of private sector banks are the HDFC Bank, which is known for the higher profitability, strong asset quality and the technological innovation, and ICICI Bank, Axis Bank, Kotak Mahindra Bank. They also have performed exceptionally well in terms of the profitability and the capital adequacy. So now we're going to read about the role and the performance of the foreign banks. So the very first role is the corporate and investment banking. तो फॉरेन बैंक्स प्राइमरली फोकस करते हैं लार्ज कॉर्पोरेट क्लाइंट्स के ऊपर, मल्टीनेशनल कॉरपोरेशंस के ऊपर, हाई नेटवर्थ इंडिविजुअल्स के ऊपर और ये प्रोवाइड करते हैं अ रेंज ऑफ सोफिस्टिकेटेड फाइनेंशियल सर्विसेज जैसे कि मर्जर्स एंड एक्विजिशंस, एडवाइजरी, फॉरेन एक्सचेंज एंड द इन्वेस्टमेंट बैंकिंग सर्विसेज. सो नेक्स्ट वन इज द ग्लोबल सर्विसेज. फॉरेन बैंक्स जो है वो ऑफर करते हैं ग्लोबल बैंकिंग सर्विसेज को, फैसिलिटेट करते हैं इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड को, क्रॉस बॉर्डर इन्वेस्टमेंट्स करते हैं and foreign currency exchange, making them key players in the global business operations in the India. Next one is the financial inclusion for niche segments. So while foreign banks have a limited retail banking presence, ये provide करते हैं specialized products and services to the high net worth individuals and the corporate clients, including the wealth management, portfolio management and the international trade finance. So now we are going to read about the performance of the foreign banks. Very first is the profitability and the asset quality. Foreign banks with their global backing and expertise ये generally maintain करते हैं superior assets quality को और profitability को as compared to the public sector banks. Or however they focus more on the premium clients rather than the mass market retail banking. So if I talk about the recent stats, then the banks like HSBC, Citibank and Standard Chartered have seen stable growth in India, but their focus remains primarily on the premium customers and the corporate banking and limiting their presence in the mass retail banking sectors. So the challenges which are being faced by the foreign banks are the limited market share. Obviously जो फॉरेन बैंक्स हैं वो उनकी काफ़ी स्मॉलर मार्केट है इंडिया के अंदर एज कम्पेयर टू द पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स or the private sector banks due to their limited branch networks which are primarily concentrated in the metropolitan areas. And next one is the regulatory constraints. Foreign banks, these are subject to the Reserve Bank of India regulations regarding the expansion of the branch networks and their mandatory priority sectors lending obligations which can reduce their profitability. So examples like HSBC India Citibank, Standard Chartered. These banks are performing well and they have a strong international presence, offering corporate banking, investment banking, and the wealth management services in India. So I hope you have cleared with the concept of banking system in India, their roles and their performances. So if you like the content, don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for the next lecture in which I will be discussing about the banking sector reforms in the India.